Good morning. My name is Amy Lawperbull, and I work on the communications team for the REC Code Manager, and I will be facilitating the Q&A sections throughout the event today. So just go to my next slide. So joining me today, I have Colette Baldwin, also from the REC Code Manager, who is our regulatory design manager. And alongside her, we have Richard Colwill, who is the operational change manager at DeCusa. So just a few bits of housekeeping to kick us off. This webinar is being recorded and the recording and slides for this event will be made available on the REC portal later this week. If everyone would mind keeping their microphones and cameras off and less speaking, please. And to ask a question to one of our speakers, we're using Slido today, which I will present the QR code on the next slide. If you're using the desktop app for Teams, you'll be able to see an S at the top of this call where you can click and access Slido. We will use Slido for questions and survey responses at the end, but please feel free to ask questions throughout the session. We do have designated agenda items to go through answers. If you want to raise a question verbally during these designated sections, please just use the raise your hand function in Teams. Okay, so I will pass over to Colette now to go through the agenda for today. Thanks, Colette.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am the lead analyst for this change proposal, and I'm joined by my colleague from DeCusa, who is the lead change representative from DeCusa for the equivalent change for the DeCusa change. Sorry, that's all very convoluted. And Richard, he will take you through the issues for the DeCusa. So I'm going to start with an overview of the change proposal from the REC. We'll hand over then to Richard, who will take you through the DeCusa change proposal. Then we'll come back and we'll have a chat about the impact assessment responses that were received, and we'll take you through a Q&A session then following the feedback responses and any questions that remain outstanding. Then we'll take you through the next steps for the REC change. Richard will do the same for the DeCusa change, and then we'll wrap up with a final short Q&A. Hopefully by that time we will have allayed any concerns, clarified any issues for you, and people will feel ready to progress the change. So if you'd like to move on then, Amy, please. Next, yeah, thank you. So next slide, please, Amy. So we're going to just a quick overview of R21. So the intention of R21 is to create a new role in the REC. This is for existing REC-accredited MEMS to be able to apply and become acceded to the DeCusa as a safe isolator provider. They'll be able to work directly with the premise owners, landlords, for isolation services, so for the fitting of an isolator or for the installation of low and zero carbon technology equipment such as electric vehicle charging points or other generation technology such as heat pumps. They won't act as a MEM when they're on site as a SIP, and they will only be allowed to do what is strictly necessary to facilitate the fitting of the isolator or the installation of the LZCT equipment. They cannot perform any other MEM activities such as moving or exchanging meters. The intention is not to step into the space of the supplier's MEM, but to stay within a particularly narrow scope of activities that are designed for the Safe Isolator Provider service. They will communicate SIPs will communicate between the suppliers and the DNOs to update them on certain information. So go to the next slide. And I think that will just take us through the scope of the work that the SIP will be allowed to do. So it's purposely designed to be very narrow so that they don't conflate the role of the SIP with that of the MEM. And so the intention is that the SIP will be able to de-energize a metering point. If reasonably necessary, adjust the terminals of the meter and the associated equipment and remake the connection to make sure it's safe and remedy any disturbance of the connection that might have occurred. and if required, terminate replacement customer tails in the meter where the customer tails have been presented and tested by the electrical contractor as part of their works, and then at the conclusion, re-energise the metering point. Thank you. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So we've put together, or I've put together, to say, a process diagram. So this is 4 short slides that basically set out the activities that I've just described. So this one is the process of becoming a SIP. So a MEM who wishes to become a SIP will need to apply to accede to the DCUSA, and through that process they'll either be accepted or not. Once the confirmation has been received by the REC code manager that accession has been successful, we will update the party register to reflect the new role, and that will be available on the REC portal. If DCUSA choose not to accept an application, they will notify the applicant, and REC code manager will notify the SIP that they've been accepted, and that concludes that slide. Thank you. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of things that the SIP will need to do with the premise owner before any work can be done. We sort of suggest that these are put into the contract between the SIP and the premise owner before any work begins. So this is a requirement that the SIP would need to ensure that the tenant or the owner-occupier has given their consent to the work to be done, because obviously we're going to disconnect their electricity, and that we've taken into account any vulnerabilities that need to be considered. That might be because they've got electricity dependent medical equipment that relies on their continuity of supply, or because they might need a third party present while the work is carried out. So we would ask the SIP to make sure that that is included. We'd ask the premise owner also to make sure that the appropriate GDPR requirements are considered in the contract to make sure that information about consent and information about any vulnerabilities that are going to be collected and shared with the SIP are appropriately managed. Once the premise owner has confirmed that they've got all the evidence necessary for that consent and vulnerabilities, they will then advise the SIP that work can go ahead, and the SIP will need to notify the DNO at least 1 day before the work begins. The purpose of that is so that the DNO, if they're getting notifications of clusters of outages, that they don't begin unnecessary investigations, so that they're aware the work's taking place. I think Richard from DCUSA might have a little more he can share with us on thoughts on that. We haven't got a defined solution as yet, but it's something that they're looking at. Next slide, please. So on site, so the SIP will attend the site and will conduct a risk assessment. One of the first questions they'll also ask is the site already de-energized? If it is, the SIP will abort the job and notify the premise owner that they can't continue. We cannot interfere with the supplier's disconnection or DNO's disconnection for whatever reason, so the work cannot go ahead. If the site is energised and the SIP decides it's safe to continue to carry on, they will then start the process to go through and de-energise the site. If they're concerned that this is not safe to proceed, and that might be because there's evidence of interference with a meter or a fault, they will advise the supplier. If they're concerned that there's damage or danger to the DNO equipment, they will provide the notifications to the DNO using the normal category A or B processes. Suppliers and DNOs will then remedy whatever issue as preventing the work going ahead, and once they've provided confirmation back to the SIP, they will then proceed and on to de-energization. Next slide, please. So whoever's fitting the isolator or L and ZCT equipment will then confirm works complete, and the SIP will then re-energise the supply point. If that re-energization is taking place on the same day, the question asked of the SIP is whether it's a smart meter. If it is, have comms re-established themselves at the end of the process? If they had, all good to go. If they haven't, they will need to notify the supplier and the customer so that the supplier can take whatever action is necessary to address that. If they're not going to re-energise the site on the same day, if they're going to leave it temporarily de-energized, they will need to notify the supplier and detail the change of energization status so the supplier can do the necessary updates as necessary. At the point they return to site to re-energize the supply point, they will then obviously need to update the supplier with the change of information. Next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Richard so he can give us a quick overview of DCP 394.
Yeah, thanks very much, Colette. I will come on camera for this chart. Yeah, so if you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so DCP 394 very much runs hand in hand with the REC change. So effectively, if you think about DCP 394 effectively looks at the end game. Okay, if these safe isolation providers did exist and they were undertaking safe isolation works, clearly they are now doing that under the auspices of someone other than the supplier. And when MEMS at the moment work under the auspices of a supplier, there's already agreements in place. There's already contractual legal agreements in place within DCUSA, where a supplier will work on the distributors, and when I say distributor, I mean DNO or IDNO assets and vice versa. So those agreements are already in place. If a safe isolation provider role is established, there's a need for the legal relationships between the supplier and the SIP and the distributor and the SIP. And 394 has been raised to establish this. So establish the process and then also establish the legal requirements. So effectively what DCP 394, the output will be legal texts upon which a SIP would have to agree to if they wanted to accede to DCUSA and undertake safe isolation works. And if I go through what the legal text will contain, it will firstly contain a condition that only a REC-accredited MEM can apply to become a SIP, and then clearly that at the start demonstrates certain competencies that, you know, a MEM already undertakes de-energization works, is working on behalf of suppliers. It will define what the safe isolation works is, and that's what Colette's just ran through. So de-energizing, re-energizing, and then adjusting or replacing meter tails where relevant or where appropriate. It will state that obligation that the works will only be undertaken by someone working on behalf of the SIP and with the permission of the customer. So effectively what this DCUSA change would state, if approved, is the distributors, DNOs, IDNOs and suppliers consent to a SIP undertaking the safe isolation works. It will not state that you have the customer's consent, and Colette also has just touched on that. So that will be a separate arrangement outside of DCUSA, but effectively by acceding to DCUSA and becoming a SIP party to DCUSA, you are then in an agreement with a DNO, IDNO and supplier that you can work on their assets at the metering point to undertake the safe isolation works in that restricted arena. And then it will also put obligations that hopefully MEMS are very familiar with, so that the SIP will act in accordance with good industry practice and comply with the REC meter operation code of practice. There will be clauses in relation to provision of information, and again, Colette has touched on that a bit. So from a distributor point of view, clearly they will be interested in things they're already interested in. So if you come across any dangerous incidents, and it will be the same principle. So if you come across something with an immediate danger, you would utilise the category A, and for a majority of DNOs, that's a phone call. I think some may have this online tool now, but the same thing is it's an instant contact, and then this, the distributor would come out on site as they would now to address any immediate concern. And if it was an incident that you were able to make safe, then a category B scenarios, data flows would be used as usual, and the REC change is catering for that. So there will be a new SIP role, and there will be the ability to send these flows, acting as a SIP. And there will be clauses in relation to liability in respect to any actions, procedures, costs, demands, claims, expenses, liability, loss or damage. So effectively, what that's saying is, as a SIP, you will be interacting, or the legal terms interfering, which sometimes may sound not quite appropriate, but effectively you're interacting with other people's assets, and that legal relationship will be there. Okay, if something goes wrong, how do we establish who's responsible for that? So there will be clauses in relation to that, and then it will also state that if this Decusa change is approved, effectively it will introduce a new section 2H. I'd expect you to, within Decusa, we have section 2A to 2F currently, rather. Sorry, and this would introduce section 2G, and that details the relationship. So section 2G would be the supplier to SIP and the distributor to SIP legal relationship, the agreement, and this is where these clauses would sit. Now, if a SIP acceded to Decusa, they would then have the ability to raise change proposals in relation to those clauses and vote on changes in relation to those clauses, but only those clauses. So anything that's relevant to the SIP, you would be able to vote on. And there's also various other changes effectively stating that if a SIP accedes to Decusa, they do not have to contribute to Decusa costs, which other parties do. You would not need to become a panel or board member as others do. So you're very much acceding to Decusa to effectively sign a legal contract with DNOs and IDNOs to agree that, yes, we can undertake this work, and this is the legal contract that needs to be agreed by all parties for that work to be undertaken. That's it in a nutshell. I think I saw a comment come up which I haven't read yet, sorry, and I think I've seen some hands up, so I don't know if I hand back over to REC to coordinate those.
Richard, sorry, it's Colette again. Just to say, we talked about the Decusa notification to the DNO, and I mentioned that you were going to just mention that as well.
Yeah, so I think we've heard a few. I think some DNOs may want to know about every job, and I think that's something that we need to consider in the 394 working group. So I think effectively one of the concerns is if the distributor wasn't informed prior to the work being undertaken, and for example, that work was in, let's say, a block of flats, and the distributor may be getting alerts that supply is going off, they may go and visit that site if they didn't know that it was safe isolation works being undertaken. So it looks like we may need to look at the ability for a distributor to know in advance of works. So if they did see something happening, they're getting alerts for off supply, they know that it's not a concern. They know that actually there's works being undertaken there that's legit. It's not something that we need to go out and investigate. And that would eliminate the risk of obviously sending a person out to investigate that wasn't necessarily required. So I think, yeah, that's something that we will consider as a working group, whether that can be a simple mechanism on the Decusa website. So, and this is early thinking on this, so forgive me, but if a SIP signs up to accede to Decusa, could we then give them a login on the website like we do other parties, and then every time they agree to undertake safe isolations work, they can alert the distributors via the Decusa website, and then that acts as a record of jobs being undertaken. and that probably would then facilitate the liability clauses as well, of knowing who the last, who were the last people on site, etc. So that's something that I think we will consider further as a working group, but clearly we will try and, if that facility is in use, we'll try and make it as simple as possible. So it's all about just making sure the right communications are there, so that all parties are comfortable that they're being informed of stuff when they should be.
Thanks, Richard. Next slide, please. Thank you. And next one, please. Okay, so we issued this out for impact assessment to the industry, and we were heartened to receive 13 responses across the spectrum of parties. So thank you to everybody who responded. Many of the responses received raised some extra questions that either weren't covered in the initial assessment or were clarifications on the proposed solution. We've created and shared an FAQs document with you. Unfortunately, we didn't get it finished until yesterday afternoon, so I appreciate you might not all have had the opportunity to read and digest it in full, but we hope you'll find it useful and it will address the areas of concerns. Please feel free to raise any additional questions using Slido or the chat. And a copy of the FAQs document can be found on the change proposal page on the REC portal for you to download if you can't put your hands on it anywhere else. Next slide, please. So just a quick summary of the feedback that we received. The suppliers were broadly supportive but wanted additional clarity on roles, responsibilities, liabilities and costs. We set out an optionality for how parties would communicate with each other. We provided the use of market messages or SDEP. There was an overwhelming preference for the use of the market messages, so the deflows. And we asked about implementation timescales, and they varied between 8 weeks and 18 months. From the D&O community, we received responses that were broadly supportive again. There were some concerns about the impacts where smart meters were installed, and they would receive alerts, and they have a reporting mechanism, and they receive funding for addressing faults with regard to those off-supply issues. They were concerned about the process. I think we've addressed those. We've additionally, they recognise that this would offer a service to landlords that suppliers are currently not able to adequately resource at the moment, and that's mainly due to rollout activities. So they felt having extra providers available to premise owners would really help, and it would allow the DNOs who are currently sort of a backup service for parties to focus their efforts on maintaining and improving the network, particularly with their net zero targets in mind. And we received contact directly from meter operators, and again broadly supportive, particularly of including the use of the market messages, and agreeing that implementation would be relatively simple and the lead time should reflect that. Some members would have liked to have seen the scope of the SIP work to have been slightly wider, but I think for the reasons that Richard's outlined, it's been kept specifically narrow so as not to step over into the MEM activities. I think this is the point where we were going to pause and sort of address questions. So as I said, we gave a lot of information out in the FAQ document, which hopefully you've had a chance to at least skip through, if not read in a little more detail. But at this point, we're happy to take questions, both myself and Richard. So Amy, do you have Slido questions, or are we going straight to chat?
Yes, so we've had a few questions come in through Slido. Okay. So I can read them out for you if you want, if you're happy to answer them, Colette. So first one we have is, how does the SIP know who the supplier is?
Okay, so the proposal here is that we'll look at extending the use of the EES, the Electricity Inquiry Service, for the SIP to provide access to the details of the supplier, so the premise address, the MPAN number, and the registered supplier, and that's how we expect to be able to identify the supplier for the SIP.
Thank you. And then next one, what records do we need to keep of what we have done? If we aren't the MEM, we won't have record of the meter.
Okay, right, what records do we need to keep? You're not changing or updating anything as a SIP. You're effectively de-energizing and re-energizing. So in terms of the information that you will need to do, to record, is we're saying at this stage that we only expect you to give the supplier information that you've been there and acted as a SIP, and that to the DNO that you were there in advance of the work so that they knew it was going to happen. The only other exception to that will be if there is information you need to send with regard to the energization status change, or information about faults and damage or interference. You will need to keep a record that you've been there, because as a SIP, any work you do will come under the same assurance regime that you will have as a MEM. Okay,
Thanks, Colette. So next one we have is, if the DN/re-en takes longer than 24 hours, will the SIP be required to send a D0010? If not, why not?
Okay, at this stage we're recommending the D139 as the change of energization status notification, which will send the supplier a meter reading within the record itself. So we haven't set out a requirement for the SIP to do anything more than that. If you think about it, I mean, in reality, this is nothing and no different a scenario to the power being tripped out because of a fault. And if that fault takes longer to reconnect, than sort of overnight, say for argument's sake, you wouldn't expect to get a D10 once the DNO reconnects the supply. So we felt it was important that the supplier knew what happened, so that they can address any potential questions regarding settlement. But we're not expecting the meter to have advanced at all. So we're sending the register reading really as a confirmation of that.
Thank you. Next one, will the SIP have their own distinct market participant code?
Yes, so for sending flows, the SIP will have a roll code, and we'll be able to send messages as a SIP. The reason we've done that is to ensure that the market messages that come from the SIP are processed by the supplier, because what we wouldn't want is the SIP who, if we use the MEM roll code and the suppliers were receiving flows from parties who weren't their appointed MEMs, they may choose or may not be able to receive and action the information. So we felt that by making it a distinct roll code and the scenario variants for the messages, making it clear the purposes for which the SIP was sending the information, that would remove any confusion and make it clear the purpose of the information that's being provided.
Thank you. And next question, who pays the SIP?
The premise owner.
Wonderful. Will the SIP act as data controller for any customer info? And if they identify unrecorded vulnerability, will they have a requirement to inform other parties?
Good question. I imagine in reality, I'm not a data protection specialist, so I will ask the question of the legal team, but I believe that the data controller will be the premise owner, and that as part of their data collection activity from their tenant, they will get the necessary consent to provide the information to the SIP for the purposes of carrying out the work. and as the SIP won't have any knowledge of existing recorded vulnerability, they will have no obligation to inform anyone else because they won't know that it's in conflict or is missing data. But all check in terms of the GDPR requirements regarding controller and processor.
Thank you. If we are already registered with REC, what would be the cost to become a SIP?
It should be a fairly, I don't think we've envisaged a cost, but I think at the end of the day, we're saying that a MEM who is already through the accreditation process and is already qualified and acting as a MEM, we're extending the role of the MEM to become a SIP. I'm not sure in terms of whether there's any cost from DCUSA in that regard. Perhaps Richard, if he's available, can answer that question.
No, there's no cost for DCUSA. So effectively, you accede to DCUSA, sign on the dotted line, so to speak, and then distribute. That would be approved by the panel, and then that would be a sort of sit-in legal agreement between the SIP, who's clearly met the requirements, the supplier, DNO and IDNO, and then that will effectively say we allow you to undertake this work on our assets, and I guess yeah, and it will say you do not need to let us know about that work, but you can't do anything else. And then if you contract with a customer, you know that you have distributor and supplier authority to work on their assets for that reason, and then clearly you're going to get the consent of the customer as well, as Colette said. So we didn't envision any cost in that sense. It's more setting up the legal agreement and making sure that everyone's satisfied that the work can, all parties are happy that that work can be undertaken.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does accredited MEM mean qualified to MOCOP?
Yes.
Wonderful. There has been no mention of installation of an isolator. Is this something a SIP is allowed to do during the period of isolation?
I'm confused a little by the question because the purpose is to de-energize to allow the installation of an isolator or L and ZCT equipment.
Yeah, so I think in this sense, the SIP, you kind of have to separate the roles. So a safe isolation provider will be approached and can do the work to de-energize, allow work to safely be undertaken, and then re-energize. If, for example, a installer of isolators happens to be a SIP, then they would undertake that. They would have two different roles within that same job. So I think it's important to almost envision them as different people. So we need a SIP to help us do the job safely, and then we have the contractor doing whatever that job is, installing electric vehicles, heat pumps, isolators, new consumer units. The SIP re-energizes. So it may be that happens, but they're not the SIP in that middle bit.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Richard. Next question. If a SIP installs the isolator, who owns the isolator? I would say that it's the premise owner. They've contracted for the work and they've paid for the SIP or the contractor to install it.
Thanks, Colette. Next question. How would the SIP send a data flow for Cat B/C codes if they are not the appointed MEM?
The SIP will, as a REC-accredited MEM, will have access to send and receive market messages, and we've set out how the market messages would be used. Richard, I think in cases of category B and C, they aren't Are they market messages, stroke deflows, or all the mechanisms?
They are, yeah, they're market messages through deflows, and effectively you would follow the same process, but you would have a market role as a SIP.
Yes.
So as a SIP, when you get that new role, you will have the ability to ping flows to all distributors
And all suppliers.
or suppliers, whereas at the moment you can only send a flow to your appointed member. So the REC change and the subsequent system changes will allow for that.
Thank you. Next question, what would happen if we come across an RPU? How would we know when the supplier is? Oh, I'm not sure if there's more to that question.
Okay.
If the poster for this question, if you feel, please feel free to unmute yourself and provide some clarity on this.
So hi there, guys. Sorry, there's also a correction on the message. The question there is obviously if we come across an RPU tamper, how would we know who the supplier is at that point of the installation so we can report that tamper?
So we are proposing that in the solution, the SIP will be able to access the electricity inquiry services to view the identity of the supplier.
Okay, amazing. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, what audit requirements will there be for a SIP?
So the assurance team will look at all the work that the MEMS perform, including any activities they perform as a SIP, and so they will come under their REC performance assurance audit regime.
Thanks, Colette. Can you change tails without fitting an isolator? For example, 16mm to 25mm. Isolator already fitted.
I'm afraid I'm not a technical electricity expert. I can't answer that question. Richard, is that something you can help with?
We might have to take it away. So effectively, you will be approached because there's work going on, and you need to, and they need someone to isolate the supply for the safety of that. Now, I think the reason why there is the slight scope extension meter terminals, because I think they may be damaged, it's reasonable. And the replacement, I think one example came from if a consumer unit is being fitted and then the contractor is a bit more technically minded regarding that as well. I'm not sure if there's any other thoughts from people on this call, but I think that the answer is probably not, if it's because the SIP's role is to isolate for a job to be done and then re-energize. And
can I suggest, Richard, that we take this question away and we will publish an updated question on the FAQs document?
Yeah, that's fine. We can definitely take that question away. Thank you both.
Okay.
So next question, in the FAQs, the SIP contracts with the premises owner. This is fine for council or LH, but what about LZCT installers? DCP 394 includes these installers too.
So the installers can only be working on behalf of the premise owner in that regard, because you can't just, I can't imagine a scenario where the installer doesn't have the consent of the premise owner to fit equipment at the premises. Unless we've got another scenario that we haven't envisaged. So it may well be that what you call it, an owner occupier, which is why we've defined it as premise owner, can arrange for this to be done.
I mean, it might be a technicality, but the idea of this is to make it a practical solution for the industry, particularly the low carbon technology installers. So my understanding of the 394 group was that we would allow SIPs to contract with the installers to facilitate that isolation for them, rather than having to go through the premises owner every time, because I don't think that would be very practical. So I know later on it's about having consent by the premises owner, but I don't see why the SIP can't contract directly with the low carbon technology installers, which is what the DCP 394 refers to.
I think they will still need the consent of the premise owner to do this. I get what you're saying about the direct contracting party, but ultimately, I still think it's the premise owner who has to give the consent to the work.
I'm not saying that. Yeah, I agree. I'm not saying it's not about consent. This is about the contract with the SIP, you know, and the put to work, if you like, which is the installer will have to get consent from the premises owner. I get that, but the actual contract with the SIP, my understanding would be between the SIP and the installers who requested the isolation.
Can I take that away, Warren, and we'll query that? Okay, thank you. Somebody's put a statement, I think, above that. We need the consent of the owner. We do not need the consent of the occupier. It is the owner's responsibility to inform the occupier. No, we've sort of made it clear that you can't switch off a tenant's electricity supply without their consent. And it's particularly important if there are vulnerability on site that needs to be taken into consideration, which is why we said the premise owner will have the responsibility to inform and evidence consent to the disconnection of the electricity supply. So it will be the owner's responsibility to do that, and it will be the responsibility of that premise owner to provide confirmation evidence that that's been done.
Thanks, Colette. Next question, can a meter be moved or adjusted in its location to make room for a switch mover, say by 300 millimeters?
No. The point of this is not to step into work that the MEM would do. If you need the meter moved, that is something that the supplier and the MEM arrange with the consumer.
Thank you. Can tails be upgraded without fitting an isolate, one already fitted?
Technical question again, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that. Richard?
We can take that one away if not.
Well, unless Richard's got an answer.
No, I think that, yeah, I think that's one that we'll take away and provide an offline response if everyone's comfortable with that.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you both. If a DNO needs to know 24 hours before, how do they know when meters are fitted at the moment?
Yeah, the DNO needs to know before. I'm not quite sure I understand what the questioner is trying to get to.
I think I might know what because we don't normally get to know when a meter's fitted.
No, I appreciate
it. Particular, right, but I think this one is more likely to be in clusters rather than, you know, just an odd meter in there. I think that was the point of that. I think if I understood the question right.
Yeah, I think that's how I would read it as well. It was particularly to address clusters of work. So I think, as it might have been Warren who mentioned it earlier, that, you know, in blocks of flat, if you're taking off a number of supply points in a relatively quick order, if you like, that the DNOs might see that as a fault rather than planned work. So the idea of giving the notice was to avoid unnecessary investigations. I appreciate, you know, meter workers don't normally notify the work in advance, but this is really because we're taking off energy supply in groups rather than as individual works undertaken by meter operators, meter equipment managers. Next question.
Thank you. The FAQ mentions SIP can, if reasonably necessary, adjust the terminals of the meter. Can adjust be defined further? For example, is this also including removed?
I think that's something we're going to have to take to DCUSA, Richard.
Yeah, I think that's a question that we can review at the next working group, probably along with this next one as well, just to see if we can put a bit more clarity around the adjusting of terminals.
Okay, so I will flag these to answer at a later date. Thank you both.
Thank you. Are there any questions in chat now? Because we've seen
we have a few questions in the chat, so I'll just read those out now. And I think we have people with their hands raised as well. So I'll start with the meeting chat. We've had quite a few things come in. So the first question is, why create the SIP role? Why would you not just apply the accreditation directly to the MEM?
I think it's because we want to, we looked at this and felt that there was two things that were driving this. One is MEMs don't accede to DCUSA. So in order for the MEM to accede to DCUSA, if we wanted to keep the scope of the work clear, so it's not that the MEM in all their activities accede and accede to DCUSA, it's just for this narrow scope. Secondly, we need to create a role code within the Retail Energy Code for the SIP so that they can send communications using market messages. So from a legal perspective, it was done to keep the responsibilities and the scope of work clear and totally transparent, and not sort of potentially sort of bleeding into the role of the MEM.
Thank you. Next question. As I understand the process of if a SIP changes, installs an isolator but cannot complete the job on the same day, then a D-flow needs sending to a certain industry body. However, only the supplier can send this. So how does the SIP manage to communicate to the supplier so the supplier can be compliant with industry rules, who in turn can then send the appropriate D-flow to the appropriate body?
We're creating the necessary capacity for the SIP to send the necessary flows that we need. So we're using, where we can, existing market messages with scenario variants that go between the SIP and the supplier, or the SIP and the DNO, specifically for the activities that we've set out. So effectively, we're creating some exceptional rules for this process. And in those market messages, in those scenarios, it will be clear what the requirements are and who they can be sent to.
Thank you. Next question. Hi Colette, as per our response, has this proposal been subject to a cost-benefit analysis? There is more to this question, so bear with me. Is this a domestic issue, and if so, should the solution be appropriately targeted?
Okay, so we asked for costs. We were in the impact assessment process. We got very little back in terms of parties giving an indication of that. I think when we go out, when we produce the preliminary change report, and hopefully the scope of this is clear of parties, they will be in a better position to provide an understanding of any potential costs that they might face, and therefore we should hopefully get more information on costs and benefits. In terms of, is this a domestic issue? I don't think it's entirely limited to domestic, but we are saying it's a whole current meter requirement. So I don't think we'd be stepping into what people see as the traditional sort of IMC space. But I dare say that there will be businesses out there who are looking for maybe the installation of LZ and LNZ-CT equipment, rather than, just maybe an isolator. So, as businesses provide more things like electric vehicle charging points, I can see a scenario where you know, the businesses are looking for this as a solution. And as we're not limiting this to only local authorities and housing associations, but we're saying anyone who owns the premise can require this, then I don't think it limits it. I think for traditional I&C scenarios, I imagine that those meter workers are directly appointed by the customer sometimes, or sometimes by the supplier. And I would say that the likelihood of them being able to access the service is probably easier as the customer for a very large industrial business rather than a sort of estate of housing or a small business unit, retail park type thing. Does that answer your question, Steve? I think you're on mute, Steve. Still on mute, Steve.
He does actually have another question, Colette, so I can pose that now if you're ready.
What works out is IT. As per response to wording, because you can to include that it will only be able to re-energize a metering point that's being energized, where a metering point is found to be energized, and when the SIP test that they must abort the work and may not change the energization status. Yes, the intention is, and it's clear in DECUSA legal text, that basically if the SIP attends a site and finds that the supply point is already de-energized, then they cannot undertake any work.
Thank you. And I believe we have someone with their hand up. Unfortunately, I can't see who that is.
All right, sorry. See if I can see.
Hi, it's Ed Green from Eon with my hand up. Hi, I've just got two concerns really. The first one was around the provision of a D10 meter reading when a site is DN re-en for longer than 24 hours. I do appreciate what you're saying in terms of making comparison to, a network-wide outage, such as, some sort of force majeure, act of God, that type of thing. But this is being actively initiated by a person on site, and I think from a customer point of view, it could be viewed as being very different. From reading through the FAQs, etc., the underlying reason for this, or a lot of what seems to be touted as the benefit, particularly, is around housing associations, local authorities, those sorts of things, which are likely to have vulnerable customers. And I think the provision of an actual D10 meter reading where this work is being carried out, I think acts as quite a good safety net in terms of ensuring the accuracy of customer billing. Because at the end of the day, from a customer's point of view, you've got an industry person at site there. I think it will be very, very good working practice for them to obtain a reading, as they'll be there anyway. They can just look at it and send through that flow. And I think it will make a good watermark point, as it were, in terms of customer billing and just general engagement.
Ed, I think when I looked at the D flow, the D139 does include a register reading already.
It does, but this would allow it to do, flow through the meter read validation process, etc. It's something we could live without, but I just feel it would be very good industry practice to provide it as a formal meter reading while somebody's on site. My other consideration would be around unrecorded vulnerability. You mentioned earlier that there is no obligation, and I can see that perspective. But I also think in the current climate, we know that as an industry, there are a large number of unrecorded vulnerabilities out there, and it can be quite hard to get that information. And I just think that it's an ideal opportunity that if something's observed, that it should be passed on to the supplier so they can make the required considerations if needs be. I think, again, a bit of a safety net approach where we have somebody there, a rep from industry on site. They're never going to be able to record everything, but
no. The problem we've got is that the SIP won't have access to the current status of the vulnerability indicators that a supplier's got registered at the site, so it won't know whether that vulnerability is recorded or otherwise. They're asking the landlord to identify it when they agree to the work, just so that we don't end up having somebody disconnected who's halfway up the stairs or in a bath hoist or is on a respirator or something, so that, you know, appropriate steps can be taken for that specific work. So we're saying that, you know, the collection of the data is for a specific purpose to carry out this work. We're sort of now saying that, you know, to do what you're suggesting would be to widen the scope of that data collection, because we would have to then agree to the data being collected for permission and then get consent for the permission to be shared with the supplier. And what happens if that information is in conflict with what the supplier holds? So I think it's definitely a wider issue, and it's one that we back and forth on quite a bit during the development internally. But I think we have to be careful that when we do consider the data protection principles, when we're collecting data from the tenant, and then it's the landlord that's going to be collecting this data for the purpose of fitting equipment or an isolator, that it's in the context of that and not in a wider context. So while there might be a perceived wider benefit from collectively sharing that with a party that potentially already should have it, is probably a scope beyond the principles set out in the data protection regulations. So we can, so for that purposes, we have kept it as the, you know, that the landlord will collect the data from the tenant and provide it to the SIP solely for the purpose of completing the work.
And I do understand the consideration around data sharing, and as a supplier, I would be happy with just receiving blind information from the SIP without sharing the vulnerability data. So if the SIP observes, for example, customers in a bath hoist or in a wheelchair or whatever they observe, just pass that information along. Perhaps the use of unrecorded vulnerability is the wrong terminology, but just observed vulnerability.
We'll take it under consideration. I can't make any promises. I will talk to the legal representatives about it. But you know, as I say, it really has to fit within the principles of the data protection regulations.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I'm just thinking from a, you know, from a customer point of view, you know, within that journey, if it can be identified, just pass the information on.
Yeah.
Rather than, you know, necessarily comparing lists of vulnerabilities, etc. If something's observed, do they have that route to pass it on to make sure the customer is safe? And if the supplier's already got the information, they have. If not, it will greatly help.
I will, as I say, I'll take it away, and we'll get some legal opinion on that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, both. Yeah, we just have a couple more questions in the chat. So first one, how will this work for the housing groups?
Andrew, could you expand on your question a little more, because I'm not quite sure I understand it. Can you give me some context? Okay, Andrew, do you want to add any more to the chat?
Oh, has he managed to unmute himself?
Ah.
No? Okay, we do have one other question that we can go to, Colette.
Okay, so timescales for the go live of the SIP role. So this change needs the approval of the authority, both for DCUSA and for the REC, because it relates to competition in the market, and so therefore this will go off to the authority for a decision. Because there will be changes to the market messages in order for the SIPs to communicate, there will be at least a 6-month lead time for this to go live. And we'd like to do it sooner, but you know, traditionally 6 months is the minimum for system changes.
Thank you. And we've just had some clarification from Andrew on his question. So he said, so his original question was, how will this work for the housing groups? And his clarification is for meter exchanges.
Meter exchanges are still the responsibility of the supplier to customer relationship and not related to activities undertaken by the SIP. The SIP will not be able to work as a MEM at the behest of this housing association. It will be a case of that has to be done through the supplier.
Thank you. And then one final question in the chat. When will the process to accede to DCUSA be drafted?
Over to Richard.
Yep, so DCP 394 is doing that, and we have a consultation out at the moment for this, which we can put a link. Perhaps I'll put a link into the chat, but also ask if any comms go out to all the people. So we've emailed it out, the consultation, and we've just extended the deadline for that till the 18th of July. And also, I think comms went out on a REC change bulletin. But yeah, Tony, if you want to contact me afterwards as well, feel free. But there's a consultation going out at the moment, and we have the draft legal text. So we have what we believe it should look like and all the processes there. And then we'll obviously subsequently look at the consultation feedback and then read and refine any solution as we see fit. Clearly, we have some questions on the terminals that we got today, which we'll look at. So I will put the link to the consultation in the chat now for anyone who wants to take it, but we can also look at widening the scope.
I think you also included it in a slide that's coming up as well, haven't you?
I have actually, yeah. So if these slides get circulated, maybe that's the best way to do it.
Okay. Jasper has a question.
Yeah, so what party category would SIPs come under in regard to DCUSA?
So it will be a SIP party. Let me just, so effectively they will seed and then become a safe isolation provider party or SIP party.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Thank you both for answering those questions, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We do actually have another opportunity for Q&A a bit later on, so I'll hold all questions for now, and then I'm going to pass back to Colette, I believe.
Yes, thank you. So we just wanted to now just sort of clarify where we're at and what the next steps are. So in terms of the REC, thank you for your input today. We were going to use that to help update the preliminary change report, which will address any new issues that we've raised or clarify any points that haven't already been addressed in the interim report we produced. So the PCR will then be shared with the metering expert panel on the 8th of July, and then it will be circulated for consultation from the 12th of July, and it will be out for comments until the 2nd of August. So put those dates in your diary, please. We'll be providing draft legal text shortly, and that will get added to the change proposal page on the REC portal. And then the intention is to produce a final change report on the 26th of August for industry to look at, and that will go to the metering expert panel, who will make their recommendation to the authority on the 14th of September to either approve or reject this change proposal. There's an appeal window for the metering expert panel's recommendation, and that will close on the 29th of September. Next slide, please. Over to Richard.
Thanks, Colette. Yes, so as I mentioned there, there's a 394 consultation out at the moment with a deadline for responses set at 18th of July. If you have any further questions in relation to that, then please email us at DCUSA, which is dcusa@electrolink.co.uk. But if you click on that link, it will also take you to our website and give you all the details of the consultation and the documentation, and also previous working groups if you wish to look at that. The working group, we have a meeting scheduled for the 25th of July, where the working group will review the consultation responses, and the aim at present being to produce the final change report and submit that to the DCUSA panel that sits on the 17th of August. So the first task will be to go through all the individual responses. We collate them into one document, and we respond to each comment and then summarize each question. So you will see the decision making of any comments that you send through. If it goes to the panel on the 17th of August, the panel effectively review the change report to, you know, they assess it to say whether they're satisfied that it gives enough information for the accuser parties to vote. And if they do, then we will issue that out to vote. I believe that would be the 19th of August. And parties will have until the 9th of September to submit their votes. So that's the accuser parties, that would be DNOs, IDNOs and suppliers. And then we produce what we call a change declaration, which effectively is the change report, but then also the outcome of the voting. And that voting acts as a recommendation to Offgem. So on the 13th of September, assuming we go to the August panel, a change declaration will be issued to Offgem stating, here's the proposed solution, this is the outcome of the accuser parties' votes, and they will make their decision. Now, Offgem give us a date based on how urgent they believe a decision is needed. So traditionally it used to be a 5-week KPI, but now they will let us know a week or so after we submit. So we'd like to think hopefully by the 20th of September we would have an indicative date for the Offgem decision on that. And clearly I'd imagine they'll make their decision at the same time as the REC change.
We'd hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you. So last slide then, I think. Okay, so this was just a wrap up sort of scenario to address any final questions that you've not already asked. And yeah, here we go. We have a couple.
So yeah, the first one that's come in on Slido, is there any expectation that a company can exceed only to do SIP work without doing regular metering work?
The metering accreditation for, the requirements for a MEM to become accredited under the REC require that they undertake metering work and that can be evidenced and assessed. So you cannot exceed just to be a SIP. You need to be a qualified meter equipment manager under the REC.
Thank you. Next question, can you share the link in the chat for the DCP 394 proposal? So just before Richard answers this, we will be sharing the slides and recording after this session, so that link will be available to you at that point. Richard, I'm not sure if you're able to share the link with people now in the chat.
He's done that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
So that takes you to, that link will take you to the overall change proposal. And if you scroll down and go to related documents, you'll be able to get the consultation from there.
Thank you very much. And then we've just had another question come in through Teams. Is there a timescale for Offgem's decision?
I think Richard already just covered that.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
yeah, hopefully. So all going well, 13th of September goes to Offgem, and then they will let us know when they believe they'll be able to make a decision. So yeah, unfortunately at the moment that's to be confirmed, but we will articulate that as soon as they publish on their website as well, a list of all their change proposal they have for decision, and then they give an indicative date.
Thank you, Richard. We've just had another question come in through Slido. If a council owner says fit isolators, the job will come from my contractor, is that okay?
So I'm slightly confused. So yes, the premise owner can contract with the SIP for the work to be done. That's the intention of this proposal. So they will, if the council want them to fit the isolators as well as do the SIP role of de-energizing and re-energizing, providing they're qualified to do that, they will be able to undertake both activities. But as Richard explained earlier, we would see the safe isolation work separately from that of fitting the isolator or any equipment. I hope that clarifies the question.
Yeah, no, I just meant the council are the owner of the buildings.
Yes.
But quite often they don't want to pass you the job direct. They want to pass you the job through the contractor, the like building organizer people. So you would effectively have permission of the council to fit isolators for them on their properties, but the job would come from the contractor. Or do we need to go direct to the council themselves?
You need confirmation that the work is being directed by the premise owner. So yes. Whether that is through delegation of authority that the contractor has with the council, that they're acting on the council's instructions or directly from the council themselves, that will be for the SIP to assure themselves that they are working under the right permission.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Thank you. John Green's had his hand up for a little while.
Yes, thank you. Once the details of the changes to the market messages have all been agreed, yeah, will there be an opportunity for another call like this to go through the process?
Yes, I'm sure we could organise that.
Thank you.
Phil.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say Phil's also got his hand up.
Sorry, that was for before. It's okay.
All right, thank you. If you've no more questions, Phil, can you lower your hand? Lovely, thank you.
So we don't currently have any other questions on Slido, and there's been none come into the chat. So if you're happy, Colette, we can continue.
Yes, I think that covers everything that we had plans for today. So thank you for attending. Appreciate your involvement in this. It's helping us make sure that we deliver a solution that meets everybody's needs. So thank you again, and take the opportunity to note the dates for consultation responses, both in the REC and the diffuser. We look forward to hearing from you. Just to clarify, we have taken away an extra 9 questions over and above what's in the FAQs at the moment. So we will update those. It may not be before we publish the slides, so it may be another week or so before we get all the answers that you're asking for. But we will notify everybody that new FAQs have been published. So,
thank you, Colette. Thank you, and thanks to Richard as well for well, both of you for being our presenters today. Just one final point from me. We do have a feedback survey on Slido, so if you'd like to provide us with any feedback on how you found today's session, it would be greatly appreciated. And thank you to everyone who asked questions, and thank you to all for attending.